What up guys, Sven here. Today we're taking a look at one of the most difficult non-legendary Prismata units to figure out, and that's Tatsu Nullifier. It's one of those units that often warps how both players play, even if it never gets bought. Because if you can get a few of them out, then it doesn't matter how large your absorber is, or how good your defense is, it all gets completely nullified. Once again, I've looked through all of my ladder replays involving Tatsu since the early access release of the game to bring you the best examples I could find. Firstly, let's break down how Tatsu works against base set. All of these base set example replays are just me playing against myself in analyze mode. I'm not actually playing against Masterbot. Anyway, the 12 drone Tatsu rush loses in multiple ways. A single Animus into 2 Tarsiers and then spamming nothing but Rhinos and Engineers tends to work very well because you're constantly putting on enough pressure that the Tatsu player never has enough defense tempo to buy more than one Tatsu. And they're just wasting a ton of their red resources. Conduit into Gauss cannons and completely skipping absorb also works very well. Just because you can push out damage quickly and don't care that much about getting breached. The second Animus is completely wasted again after the first Tatsu, and that just puts the Tatsu rush way too far behind. After seeing how the Tatsu rush gets completely crushed, it got me wondering whether there is a better way of playing Tatsu if only one player has access to it, for the sake of gaining some perspective on how punishable Tatsu is. After messing around with a few different ideas, I discovered that going 3rd NG actually works the best. With P2 I build Conduit in Blast Forge to set up a solid defense before committing to the double Animus, and then easily get out 2 Tatsus and hopefully get a 3rd shortly after. After the 3rd one, I'm wasting a ton of red, but I'm still getting wall absorb and soak while the base player gets 0 absorb on almost every single turn, since Tatsus are freezing the granularity. P2 ends up winning with this build, and after spending a while testing different P1 tactical decisions, it seems highly probable that P1 doesn't have a way of winning without Tatsu. I tried doing something similar with the Tatsu build for P1, but it's not nearly as good as the P2 line. The standard base set P2 build is turn 2 Animus, so the Tarsiers come out a bit early, and you have to build a Blast Forge first and have to wait an extra turn to buy the double Animus. P1 still gets the 3 Tatsus, but P2 ends up in a better position and wins convincingly in the end. What we can take away from this is that Tatsu without a multitude of cheap red support like Corpus, Blood Pact, Perforator, and Nitrocybe will likely only work with the 3rd NG build. Most random sets will have a better attacker than Tarsier, so to make Tatsu work in that case would require a better defender than Wall. Something like Infusion Grid. Things get muddier if there's the red support units I mentioned earlier, since they often enable earlier timings depending on exactly what you have. First, let's take a look at some replays where Tatsu is clearly correct and results in mirrored strategies. The attributes of this particular set that make it clearly a Tatsu set is a combination of lots of support units like Husk, Flame Animus, and Ebb Turbine, as well as a lack of ultra-aggressive attackers. Vi Moranax also being very efficient gives you yet another excuse to get the 4 red, and if you choose not to go for Tatsu and your opponent does, then only your opponent will have access to Plexocell. So we both predictably go for the most common Flame Animus openings, which is a turn 2 Blast Forge for both players. From here I go for what I would consider the most standard opening for a set like this, which is to get 2 Flame Animuses, and then buy an Animus and establish a wall to defend before starting to buy the quad red units. Although Flame Animus is more efficient than a regular Animus, typically going for all 4 flame animuses ends up being way too slow in Tatsu sets, since you want to get the Tatsus at the fastest possible safe timing. He goes for a slightly different strategy, choosing to only get a single flame animus for blood phage clicks, and getting 2 animuses so that he can spend his blue on Ebs. I don't think this was better than the standard style I chose to play, since he was stuck on 2 damage into my wall for 2 turns in a row, and allowed me to get my quad red units first. But Eb can be very effective because it allows him to always have enough gold to spend all this tech he has now. I start with Vi because compared to Tatsu, although the freeze isn't passive for Vi, it's a much more efficient attacker, and this way I end up not wasting blue as well. He didn't have the option to buy his own Vi because he needed a wall, which is mainly the result of me getting the big quad red units first. I'm able to barely squeeze out a Tatsu here by holding 2 drones, which may seem like a hefty sacrifice, but this may be my last opportunity to even get a single one, and the big burst of threat and damage is necessary to make it harder for my opponent to get his own Tatsus and Vi. Generally, it's worth fairly large sacrifices to squeeze out Tatsus in most situations, since it's rare that there's another use of 4 red that's even close to as strong as Tatsu, against an opponent relying on wall absorb. Now, because of my Tatsu purchase, he was forced to hold 2 drones and take an extra damage to get his own Tatsu, which is again a worthwhile sacrifice, but imagine how easy this would have been for him if I didn't buy my own Tatsu last turn. From here the game slows down and we're just buying defense every turn, but I eventually start gaining ground with my superior economy and extra attack, after he sacked most of his drones to the Ebs. I think the difference maker was me edging out the quad red units first, and making the sacrifice that I did to get out the Tatsu. Here's a set with decent absorb and soak from Infusion Grid and Xeno, and outside of red there's a few scary burst attackers like Grenade Mech and Drake which demand respect, but if you do, then they are just inefficient attackers. The best strategy here is to play reactively, and punish early Tatsu strategies with the double blue units, and otherwise drone up until Tatsu becomes a safe strategy for you, no matter what your opponent does. So because any early rush strategy gets countered, it only makes sense for us to both be getting 3rd Engi here. Even after seeing my opponent get the 3rd Engi first, an early Tatsu rush strategy would not be viable here. Like, say I floated 4 gold here instead of Engi and planned to do the double animus the turn after. My opponent can just easily get a drone and 2 Aurics next turn, to set up triple Auric and double Blast Forge, and that timing ends up working very well, since I wouldn't be able to afford a Blast Forge while spending my quad red, since there's no really cheap red sync. He chooses to forego the Blast Forge and get the double animus first, which can be very good in many situations when you assume it'll be a Tatsu mirror, since the size of your absorber usually doesn't matter that much, and Rhinos and Engis become a good option for defense. Now he chooses to buy the Blast Forge after seeing me set up my double animus, since I'm threatening to buy either Tatsu or Lucina, and in the case that I would buy Lucina, he would really need the Blast Forge. It's pretty bad against Tatsus, but I analyzed what happens if he skips the blast, and Lucina picks him apart, so I think it was necessary at some point. On my side, you can see that I bought this Venge, which might seem weird since this puts me in a position to waste my tech sooner. But as P2, the conduit was kinda necessary for my high-econ opening, and Venge for the extra damage is usually a lot better than saving 3 green for force fields later. This also puts me at a respectable damage number that is much harder to deal with, since the Tatsu alone would only kill 2 engineers, but now my opponent will want to be buying 2 force fields to avoid losing drones. The game is accelerating so fast that we'll already be having lots of trouble defending in a couple turns. So keeping 3 econ around isn't really necessary, since wasting tons of tech resources will quickly become inevitable anyway. Now we can see that because of how I set up my Blast Forge before his animuses, I was able to get wall absorb 2 turns in a row now by keeping the walls a step ahead of the Tatsus, which ends up being fairly strong here even though this defense is very expensive. This wouldn't really be worth it if not for Infusion Grid here, since instead I'd have to have bought a wall against no damage, and I'll be relying on the grid click later when I can't afford to buy more Tatsus. On the other side of the board, it looks like his Blast Forge ended up not doing much, since all it bought was an Infusion Grid that never got clicked because he's spending all of his red on Tatsus, which is what he needs to do, otherwise I'll keep absorbing. From here I cruised to a victory, and I think the main points that won me the game was my better use of the Blast Forge, the Venge which let me push out more damage slightly faster, and my opponent not making the best use of Auric Impulse that I think he could have. Here's a set where Tatsu Rush seems like it could work. There's tons of support for a quad red strat with Perf and Nitrocybe to sink the red tech into. But it's also quite an aggressive set even if Tatsu wasn't present, since there's the combo of Scorch, Brooder, and Cluster. As P1 he went for this double perf second animus build, which I've seen as a very popular build on the ladder. However, I'm not really convinced that it's any good without good prompt red defense like Corpus and Blood Pact, along with the Perforators. Thinking that it's really greedy, I'm going for quick Scorches and buying a second Conduit, planning to get Clusters later. So I completely skip Blast Forge, which is necessary when trying to punish Tatsu with your own aggressive red build. If you try to start getting wall absorb, then that's gold you're investing into defense instead of attack. The goal here for me is to simply get enough attack to stop my opponent from buying more Tatsus, and instead buy the inefficient red defenders. In my experience, trying to both get wall absorb and stop Tatsus from being bought usually fails horribly against a good player. Unless you have more walls than they have Tatsus, a Rhino is just as good as a wall defensively, so instead I'm relying on Rhino Absorb to push out 6 damage this turn, and pressure his defense. Now if he chooses to buy his own Blast Forge, I have my own answer ready, with either just synchronized Scorches with Cluster or even add in a Brooder somewhere. Now we can see that his defense starts getting pretty rough by the time my first Scorches come in, since Rhino is his prompt defender here, which is pretty horrible. He's only doing around 3 damage per turn, so I even squeeze in a Cluster here to continue messing with his defense. Because of the way I played, he wasn't able to establish any decent attack force after this Tatsu. This is a good example of how to punish a greedy Tatsu build by pushing out as much damage as possible, and only barely defending, which is usually the best response. Here's another set where Tatsu could have some potential. There's both Corpus and Blood Pact for prompt red defense, along with Ebb Clicks and Pixies, so the Tatsu player should never have very much trouble defending and spending tech. We both start with a Wild Drone, but I set up my boreholes early with the intention of rushing 2 of them out to start killing Wild Drones. And this strategy works out very well, because the borehole absorb also means I won't be needing to buy a wall until he kills my Wild Drone. He understandably goes for the Tatsus here. However, I don't really need to do anything drastic in response here, since I think I'm already well set up against Tatsus, and we're about to see why. So now he has 2 Tatsus out, and I haven't needed to buy any prompt defense whatsoever. I'm just needing to hold this drone to save a borehole from dying. The best thing he can freeze here are engineers, which is incredibly poor value, so his Tatsus are making very little impact on this situation. This is the strength of using Vigilant units to counter Tatsu. In case anyone doesn't know, Vigilance is a concept we use to refer to units that passively generate value while defending. And in this case, Borehole Patroller defends while attacking, and Engineers comboed with Galvani drones are generating gold while defending. So if all of your defense is generating gold in attack, then the freeze value of Tatsu is pretty terrible, as we can see. Now from here I transition to Plasma Fire to start putting on serious damage, and he's not able to hold on for very long. Although he didn't play this perfectly from the start, it was quite a crushing victory, which shows that Tatsu is still skippable, even with the amazing red defense in this set. This is probably my favorite set in this video. There's amazing Absorb with Centurion, amazing Soak with Shredder and Polywall, and amazing attack from Plasma Fire. Along with Tatsu of course, and no cheap red defensive units to justify an earlier Tatsu timing. If you get Tatsu too early, then you'll lose to Plasma or Feral with Immolate. If you get too much econ, then you'll lose to a mid-econ Tatsu build. And if you did something like rush out Plasma Fire, then you'll lose to Centurion. So we have a pretty intense rock paper scissors situation with this set. So because it's very easy to punish a Tatsu rush strategy in this set, we both safely go for the third Engi without worrying about it. However, if there weren't Plasma Fire and Feral, then you might want to hold back on the third Engineer and build up your econ slower. Now's around the time we need to start considering when to buy the double Animus. Since Tatsu will always be able to work in a set with defense this good. The question is just, when is the earliest possible timing where we can get it without being punished? We need to consider that if we bought double Animus next turn, is there a way we can transition to Centurion if our opponent buys Plasma Fire? Because at that point we're on 5 tech buildings, and we don't want to be wasting it all every turn. At this point I think I can set up the double Animus next turn, and I bought this one Doom drone to allow me to get 3 more Doomies next turn. At that point I'll have established 19 income, and can intermediately buy Feral Warden for defense before getting Centurion. It still feels a little risky, but sometimes you have to take a risk to try and get the Tatsus first, because that can be a pretty massive advantage in mirrored strategies. Instead of mirroring, he chooses to try and rush me down, so I end up stopping the Tatsu purchases after a single one, which feels pretty bad for now, but I knew this could happen. Since I established a decent sized economy, I'm able to transition to Centurion fairly easily from here. I'll have to waste a bunch of red both this turn and the next, but taking into account that Centurion is ridiculously strong, wasting this red doesn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things. If he sets up his own Centurion, then it won't be worth that much if I have 2 Tatsus freezing it. And he's pretty far off of getting his own Tatsus to freeze my Centurion. In the end, it seemed like he stretched himself too thin, at first trying to punish my Tatsus, and then after realizing that I was prepared for it, getting his own Centurion, which gets frozen, and then intending to try and get his own Tatsus. I think with optimal strategies, This set would play out where both players econ up with all the Doom drones the way I did, and my opponent would mirror Tatsu half a turn behind while we both skip Blast Forge. Here's another set with a pseudo rock paper scissors feel to it. If you go for Tatsu too early here, then you're bound to lose to Vigilant units like Borehole and Cauterizer, or you could just get pressured down by Tantalum Rays and Venge Cannons. If you go too high econ, then you'll get slammed by a mid-econ Tatsu build, since defense grid is really weak against it. So my thought process going into this game was that the attackers and vigilants are good enough here, that Tatsu won't work without getting D-grid for defense. But if you buy D-grid for defense, then you'll lose to Tatsu without D-grid, effectively cancelling each other out. This leads me to believe that the best way to play this set is really just to buy attackers on 13 drones, and play it out as if Tatsu and defense grid don't exist, and only transition to Tatsu if your opponent gets greedy and sets up the triple Blast Forge. After seeing him go for the third NG build, I knew that I needed to set myself up to be able to buy Tatsus if I need to. So my way of doing that here is just to buy a single attacker per turn, while econing up, since this is a set without a red sync and I'll need a decent economy to be able to afford the double Animus. Isocronus makes this a much more viable strategy for me in this case, since I won't only be buying Gauss cannons that get absorbed by a wall. He strangely decided to go for the triple blast, and in response I go for that double Animus that I've been holding back on. He gets the D-grid here, and I thought it would have been better for him to go for Omega Splitter, since D-grid is basically just a drone factory stapled to two walls when it's getting frozen by two Tatsus. Since I was curious, I went back and analyzed what happens if he gets Omega there, as well as more Galvani drones earlier, but it doesn't even seem to get close to changing the result of the game. By the end of the game here, I was somehow able to even get another Tatsu, since my opponent was stuck on a measly 5 damage. Like I mentioned earlier, I think this game should have been a normal 13 drone game with standard attackers. But things changed completely when he chose to get the third engineer in his opening. I'd like to just briefly mention that Tatsu synergizes extremely well with units that provide you with a large amount of defense tempo, like Antima Comet, Thunderhead, and Zatron. Tatsu can be viable in almost any situation where you don't have to worry about your defense for several turns, since Tatsu's biggest weakness is being denied by attack pressure from the opponent. I encourage everyone to experiment with simply getting these units and then transitioning to Tatsus, since it's a very strong strategy. But I won't be going in depth with these strategies, since they are often simplistic. To me, the real star of the show and the point of interest for those sets are the unit that generates the defense tempo itself. And I'll definitely be making analysis videos for some of them in the near future. That's it guys, I hope this video has helped out some of you that have been struggling with Tatsu. It's something even I have had trouble figuring out for a very long time. Thank you all for watching.